Greetings. My name is Reverend Olivia M. and I am Associate Editor at the R.H. Boyd Publishing Corporation. The lesson for Sunday, April 11th is titled Confession and Correction in Adult Christian Life and is taken from Ezra chapters 9 and 10 with focus on Ezra 10 verses 1 through 12. The passage examines Ezra's confession of guilt and praise to God for the justness of God's punishment to his people for their disobedience. Ezra offers his prayer on his own behalf as well as on the behalf of the corporate community. He had not committed some of the sins that his people had. Nevertheless, he could not disassociate from the corporate body of his people and their sin. Ezra's confession was multi-generational in that he spoke of the sins of his forefathers, sins that had resulted in their exile from their homeland. Their time of captivity was a method of purifying the people and reestablishing a close relationship between them and God. But apparently, the exile had not accomplished its purpose because the people continued to stray from their obligations to the covenant. Now, previous generations had been steeped in sin and that sinful, rebellious behavior that had continued on into the present generation. So Ezra's prayer emphasized the grace of God. It was God's grace that had allowed the people to return to the land from exile. The temporal act of freedom from exile occurred through an edict of Cyrus in 538 BC, but it was the Lord's graciousness that had allowed the kings of Persia to grant the Jews freedom to return to Israel and rebuild the temple. Yet despite this grace, they were once again in bondage, but bondage to sin. Now, leaders had reported to Ezra that some of the Israelites had been involved in their pagan neighbors' ungodly practices, which meant they had married Gentiles. Now, marrying outside the community of Israelites was one of God's prohibitions. But let's be clear, the prohibition was not about racial difference because the people of the surrounding area were of the same Semitic race. The reason they were strictly prohibited was religious. So should God's people marry outside Israel, they would be tempted to participate in pagan and idolatrous worship. Intermarrying with people who were not worshipers of Jehovah was symptomatic of the way the people disregarded all other aspects of God's law. Israel had lost its way, and the people had lost their conviction to obey the laws of God. They had taken to the worship of idols and through their association with their pagan spouses. Sometimes people can lose their way, lose their sense of direction in life, and turn away from the values they once held. We usually think of people doing this when they're young, but sometimes it happens when they're old as well. And I was looking on social media the other day, and someone asked to name some of the values that their old school parents or grandparents had held. And one of the most common that came up was that during a thunderstorm, parents or grandparents might say, "Turn off those lights while the Lord is doing his work." Now, many people had bittersweet posts attesting to the things their parents and grandparents believed. Now, most of us don't bother to turn off the lights anymore or other devices during a thunderstorm. But these were once practices and they had reasons for their beliefs. My father was a pastor, and I remember growing up thinking my parents had so many old-fashioned rules and I just couldn't wait to get out from under their rules and do whatever I thought I wanted to do. Well, I did, and I found out that my parents had good reasons for the rules they had, and I returned to most of them. As I grew in my personal relationship with God, I recognized that I needed to have a relationship with God that was pleasing to Him. So now I have to smile when I acknowledge that I have come back to many of the values of my parents, except now they're my values too. So how can we recapture the values we once held or cherished? Ezra led the returned exiles in prayer and repentance, and afterwards he read the book of the law, to which the people listened and then joyously worshiped God. But the exiles returning from Babylon, in coming back, they were faced with a dilemma. Many of them had entered forbidden marriages that had children, and their newfound relationship with God posed a problem for them in these marriages. So quite naturally, this was a concern, especially as it related to the children. They were facing a serious and complicated issue of intermarriage between Israel and the peoples of pagan nations. So the people gathered with Ezra were concerned about their status before God and troubled by knowing they had violated a command. Ezra and his people knew that they had to address the problem and that had lingered in the nation's life. So as believers at times, we're called to separate from people because, to capture another phrase of old school parents, if you lie down with dogs, you come up with fleas. So most of us have found ourselves at one point or another in life associating with a person or persons who are not in our best interest to be around. And sometimes the process of extricating ourselves can be difficult or even painful. But purging also must occur at times for the sake of our spiritual growth. We've seen stories on the news about someone who got in trouble, and family and friends will remark that the person began associating with a bad crowd of bad influencers. So when I was young, there were people that my parents would not allow me or my siblings to associate with, and I thought they were being old-fashioned or judgmental or maybe even elitist. But of course, I later learned that I must choose carefully and prayerfully who belongs in my inner circle of associates. As Christians, we're called to stretch beyond our comfort zone and share the good news of Jesus Christ in word and deed. We know that Jesus himself was criticized for the kind of people he hung out with, and like him, we can't get caught up in worrying about what other people will think about us for choosing to show love for people who may have been disregarded as unlovable. The important thing in our association with unbelievers is to be a thermostat in the room and not the thermometer. You see, the thermometer merely reflects the temperature of the room. The thermostat sets the temperature in the room. So let your faith guide you in setting the temperature and tone wherever you go and with whomever you associate. Still, it's not healthy for Christians to spend all of our time with people who do not hold or reflect our values. But we can still be the friend that everyone can and should hang around. We can be the trusted advisor that unbelievers come to for truth without judgment, and still be the strong believer that Christian friends come to for wise counsel and prayer. But in order to be that person, we must stay attuned to our own faith walk and ensure that we're walking in the path of righteousness for his name's sake. But thankfully, because of Christ's sacrifice on Calvary, when we stray, we can always return to a right relationship with him through confession and correction. Once again, I'm Reverend Olivia Cloud, and I hope you've enjoyed this week's lesson. Be sure to like this video and subscribe to our YouTube channel for updates. Follow us on social media channels at rhboyd.co and on our website at www.rhboyd.com. Thank you.